In this video I'm going to show you 5 simple exposure tools to help you to expose for the perfect image or video clip, and they are simple, easy to use. I'm going to show you how to set them up, how they work, and then you can use them as well. Hey guys, Florian here, good to see you. I hope you all guys doing fantastic. As mentioned already, today we're going to talk about 5 exposure tools within a Fujifilm system. Those settings are generic settings, so you can copy them to any single camera. And today we're going to use the X-T3 for this tutorial. But as mentioned already, those settings are generic settings and you can use them pretty much on any single Fujifilm camera. Without further saying, let's dive into it. So guys, we're starting off with our LCD screen and exposure preview. So this means basically if you would change your aperture, ISO or OIS, you should be able to see a change on your LCD display. If this does not happen, you need to come down into your menu, go over to the setup menu, go over to screen setup and scroll down to page number 2 and come to preview exposure white balance in manual mode. And then we can choose basically if you would like to have a preview of the exposure and white balance, or if we just want to have a preview of a white balance. I personally choose preview exposure and white balance together, and when you switch the setting on, you can see on your display how the exposure will change. Your screen will go brighter or darker and you're gonna see an adjustment to your picture. However, I personally found this a good starting point with the LCD, but as in general, it's probably not the best setting you can use, but it's a good starting point. Right now, let's say you would turn up your brightness from your screen. Right now in a sunny environment, you might misjudge your exposure because your screen is so bright that you just misjudge the exposure. So a second setting would be we're using our exposure meter reading. And how to set or how to switch this on is very simple and easy. You come back into your menu, you go down to the setup menu, come over to screen setup and scroll down to display custom settings. Go over and then find your exposure compensation scale or exposure compensation digit. The difference between is you basically with the exposure compensation scale, you got this ladder here on the side where it will display you by how many steps your image is overexposed or by how many steps your image will be underexposed. And if you would say you switch also on the exposure compensation scale, you come back to screen setup, go down to custom display settings and switch the exposure compensation digit on as well. It's basically the same process, but it will give you, rather the ladder here on the left hand side, it will give you the overexposed or underexposed image in steps or in numbers. So basically it will say -5, +1 or +2. So this means basically you can judge your whole image on your exposure scale or on your ladder exposure compensation scale. I personally rather work with the ladder here on the left hand side, which will tell me by how many steps my picture will be over or underexposed. And this is a very good point to say, okay, I can overexpose my picture by 2 stops or I underexpose it by 1 stop. However, a better tool, what I personally found works way better, is when we're coming back into our menu and we're going again screen setup and coming down to our custom display settings and we switching on the histogram. Basically you will get a histogram on your screen which will give you basically the exact same meaning of a setting, which will show you As further you go to the right, as more overexposed you are. As further you go down to the left with a histogram, as further underexposed you are. So I found the histogram a bit more helpful than the exposure compensation scale for the simple reason the scale right now shows me I'm overexposed by one step, but the histogram shows me a nice, even, balanced image. So I rather work with a histogram because I do also see the midtones, and I know exactly where my midtones sitting, where my highlights sitting, and where my shadows are sitting. So let's say I would expose for the tree here in the corner right now. So it shows me because there's coming a bit light from my main source into the image. I'm technically 0.3, 0.6 stops overexposed, and I can see that my midtones are fairly bright. I'm going slightly to the brighter side of a histogram. So I found this easier to say, okay, I want to have it histogram the midtone slightly down, but not too far. I personally think it's just easier to expose with the histogram with the compensation scale, just because I can see my midtones compared to the scale. However, another handy setting is also your live view highlight alert, which we're gonna switch on now. So basically we're coming back to our screen setup and coming down to our custom display settings again. And then we're finding our live view highlight alert. So basically this live view highlight alert works in still mode or in picture mode. And what it basically does is when we're going up to my light source right now, or to my key light, it will flashes black where the highlights are overexposed, or basically where you will lose your highlights. So then we basically could just adjust our exposure, and as soon the flushing goes away, you know that your highlights are properly exposed, that they're not clipping, and you won't lose any highlights or any details in a highlight. I do use this for photography. It doesn't work in video mode, so keep this in mind. It's mainly a function for photography, and sometimes it's actually quite handy. As it stands right now, if we're still exposing for our key light, we're still slightly overexposed by 0.6 stops. However, you don't clip any highlights, and I found this setting quite handy right now if you're doing photography and you got the sun coming out or any sort of harsh sunlight, a very bright point in your image. But also keep in mind, guys, that all the settings with the exposure compensation scale, digit or histogram will act differently to your metering mode for your still images. So that means basically if you got set your metering mode to spot meter, it will just meter for the middle point of the image. So currently we exposing for our tree here in the corner, which says I'm underexposed by -1 stop. So we would need to adjust this and expose it properly for the tree, and it would be set to plus or -0 or neutral currently. But then everything else around will be either over or underexposed, because we're actually just exposing for the tree. So keep this in mind, depends on your metering mode. The compensation scale, histogram, will work either for your whole picture or just for the middle point of your image. That depends on what sort of metering mode you use. So we've got one more setting which mainly counts for video, so let's swap over to the video mode. We're coming over to movie settings and coming down to the zebra settings. So there are two ways basically. Zebra settings coming from the left in or from a right in, and it's basically like your live view highlight alert, which is for video, which will show you which part of the image will be overexposed and where the highlights are possibly clipping. So you can adjust the zebra settings from 50% up to 100%. and I personally leave them around 60 to 80% all the time. And I found this to be a very good middle ground to say the separa settings aren't too dominant and don't distract me too much. And on the other hand side, I know when those settings might, or when I might clip certain areas of a video. And if we close down on the aperture, you can see how those separa settings slowly disappearing, and then you know which part of the image might be still slightly overexposed when you're doing a video or when you adjusted your settings. So guys, 5 simple, easy exposure warning tools, and I encourage you to try them out. You will get used to it that there's sometimes flashing things on a screen or the separa is running through. However, they did help me a lot to hit my exposure, to make sure my exposure is right. And with that said, guys, like, comment and subscribe, and I'm gonna see you, my friend, very soon in another video. Cheers guys.